Hello and welcome to episode 313 of Hot Media. I'm Bob Mann, and I'm very excited about this episode because we've been talking about it for some time. This book, Gender Threat by Dan Cassino and Yasemin Bessen-Cassino, we've talked about with Dan for a long time because of the fact that he's a regular guest on the show. Well, now it's published and he's a guest to talk with us. So, Dan, congratulations. It must feel great to actually have it done.
Well, we've written a bunch of books, and I think when you're done with your book when you are a little bit sick of it. You're like, yes, I can't wait to move on to the next thing. I can't wait to be done with this one. But that said, there's all sorts of interesting stuff in here, and it's actually more relevant than it was when we started. And we have people now in the media. We got political leaders talking about masculinity in a way that we just weren't seeing 5 or 10 years ago.
Yet in 2016, we certainly should have seen this. Now, I'm going to be a little bit flippant here, and I want you to tell me how close I'm coming to the reality. So I'm a guy. I've just lost my job where I had a female boss, and my wife is now the primary supporter financially of the family. I have to do the housework, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to buy a gun, and I'm definitely going to vote for Donald Trump in the next election. How close am I to, and of course, you've done so much research and studies and experimental research on this, but how close is my stereotypical broad-based statement?
Boy, first off, I would say the one thing you're off on is that we find that men in that situation do not do the housework, and this actually winds up being a really big problem that they will not do it because avoiding housework becomes a way actually to assert their gender identity. But it's actually a lot more subtle than that. It's not just that all of these things happen at once, causing this sort of perceived crisis of masculinity where men say, I can't show off my masculinity. I can't prove I'm a man in the way I used to. But even these little things, we're seeing even the perception that society is now favoring women over men. We're not favoring men as much as it used to. Even that perception is enough to really drive men to start embracing, we call these compensatory behaviors, other ways of showing that they are masculine. Because the ways in which men in the past showed they're masculine, well, a lot of them aren't really available to us anymore. The idea that men are going to be the primary breadwinners, that men are going to be in charge of everything. Right. So even the idea of Hillary Clinton running for president, having a woman in charge of the country, that was threatening and triggering for a lot of men and led them to all sorts of compensatory activities.
Let me ask you, what is a gender threat? Obviously, the title is Gender Threat, American Masculinity in the Face of Change. What is a gender threat which results in this compensatory activity to try to prove your manhood?
So we do have to differentiate between gender and sex, right? So sex is closer to biology. It's not quite biology, but it's closer to biology. Gender is really your identity, your idea of yourself as being a man or a woman or whatever. And that's what we're really trying to get at because sex is not very fragile, right? Your sex is pretty much set. Your gender, however, is not. And especially for men, we've lost many of the rituals that let men say, oh, this is what makes me a man. In most early societies, primitive societies have masculinity rituals where men go through a ritual and then after say, great, you're a man, congratulations. Think of a bar mitzvah, right? We don't have that in our society. So that means it's much more nebulous as to whether you can be considered a man or not. And masculinity, because of that, is a lot more fragile than femininity. I mean, if I say she's not really a woman, I mean, it's not even really a comprehensible sentence. You might think I'm talking about something about biology. Or if I say he's not really a man, you know what I mean by that. There's social expectations as to what it means to be a man, as to what masculinity is. And if men aren't fulfilling that, that's the gender threat. Right? Women still are going to face some gender threat, but their gender identity isn't as fragile as men's gender identity is.
When we have you on the program, normally it is to talk about media and politics. So I want to focus on chapter 3, Men and Politics. Obviously, there's so much more to the book, but this is one of the things that we've been talking about while teasing this coming out. And by the way, if you want to get the book, it is Stanford University Press, and we'll give you more details about getting the book before we sign off here on Hot Media. But you take a look at men and politics and voting for Donald Trump. And I look at page 45, and there is a very specific statement here, which I would like you to elaborate on. if I can open the book without destroying my equipment here. Men subjected to a gender role threat didn't become more likely to support Trump because he was a man, but rather because he was seen as a particular type of man. And by announcing their support of him, threatened men could assert their own masculinity. Elaborate on that a little bit, because I find that fascinating.
So we did a bunch of studies on Donald Trump, and I've been working with looking at threat and masculinity before the 2016 election, going back to 2013, 2014. But Donald Trump was really the best example we had of someone making these sort of masculinity appeals. Remember during the debates in 2016, the Republican debates, he talked about the size of his manhood in no uncertain terms. He talked about how attractive his wife was. He talked about even threatened to have fistfights with the other people. And this is that sort of hyper masculinity, right? Basically, this is what we look at as someone who's reacting to gender threat, trying to assert their masculinity. So it wasn't just that he was a man, because we actually did experiments where we showed that threatening men, basically inducing some experimental threat, gender identity threat, led men to support Trump more in a matchup with Hillary Clinton, but did not lead them to support Trump that much more in a matchup with Bernie Sanders. So it really isn't about, oh, I'm going to support, men. It's about, I'm going to support men over women in a particular kind of man, the kind of man that Donald Trump was saying. And he was veering very close to what we don't like this term very much. He's veering very close to what we call toxic masculinity. The idea that you're going to assert your gender identity not by trying to do something yourself, but by trying to bring others down, trying to demean women or demean homosexual men or demean men that you perceive to be less masculine than you are.
Is there a possibility, Dan? I mean, you were talking about Trump against Bernie Sanders doesn't match up the same way as Trump against Hillary Clinton because of the gender threat factor. But let's say it were Hillary Clinton against Jeb Bush or Mitt Romney. Would that not have the same clout because men who feel threatened are not just voting for men against women, but they are voting for this particular type of man, a man like Trump?
Well, also, let's remember masculinity, gender and sex are not the same thing. So there are candidates who are perceived as more masculine than others. So for instance, in 2004, John Kerry, we have good data on this, was perceived as being less masculine than George Bush. George Bush is out there clearing brush on his ranch, right? That's a masculine activity. Where John Kerry was photoshopped windsurfing. Well, that's not a masculine activity, right? His wife was the one with all the money. Well, that's not masculine, right? So he was perceived as being more feminine than George Bush was in 2004. Similarly, John McCain was perceived as being more masculine than Barack Obama was. So we have these different visions of what masculinity is, the different perceptions, and that actually really matters in the way we evaluate candidates. Now, there's nothing necessary about this in our society, but it is certainly the case that we actually perceive masculine traits as being more important to the presidency and more important to executive leadership. The traits we see are important for leadership. We say those are the masculine traits. And so there's already a built-in difficulty for any female candidate, but not just for female candidates, but for male candidates who assert a gender identity that's not the sort of very stereotypical macho gender identity. We should also note this is not just an American thing. We also did research in Mexico, where we actually have a relatively center-left candidate, Andres Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, who is very much rhetorically like Donald Trump, despite coming at it from the center-left, and attracts the same thing. We prime Mexican respondents with gender identity threat. We make them feel the threat. They become more likely to support AMLO. It's not about the policies necessarily. It really is about the rhetorical style and that personal style.
It is interesting because a lot of this goes all the way back to Mussolini, and I'm certain to many people even before, Il Duce. This whole idea of the shirtless man who's going out and he's the macho man, because that, in essence, is the protector of the commander-in-chief, even though Trump never served a day in the military and got himself out of the Vietnam draft. He to some people, simply from the swagger and the misogyny, becomes an example of what they see as an example of masculinity.
And that certainly is the rhetorical appeal he was trying to make, saying he is going to stand up for men over women, right? That he made the argument and that men were being discriminated against in our society. And no, that sounds kind of ridiculous. I mean, the idea that men who have 490 out of the CEOs of the Fortune 500, 2/3 of Congress, an unbeaten 46-0 record and winning the presidency of the U.S. The idea that men are being discriminated against is kind of ridiculous. But when we ask men, about 40% of American men say that they face discrimination because of their sex. These men really do believe they're being discriminated against, that society, which in the past they were dominating, now we're moving towards equality. And when you've been on top for a couple thousand years, movements towards equality feel like discrimination. And
So
so
even
the
if it is not against you, you're playing on a more level field and you are not the king, the dominant, the I can get away with whatever I want to get away with because I'm a man.
And we see this, I think, very clearly in the chapter we have on workplace sexual harassment, where there's things that men used to be able to do in the workplace 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago that they can't get away with now. And when you tell men who were in the workplace 30 years ago, hey, you can't do that stuff anymore, that's illegal, they go, hey, you're discriminating against me. You changed the rules on me. What the heck? This isn't fair. And they feel like there's been an injustice committed against them, despite the fact that all we're doing really is moving towards a more level playing field.
I was in a situation many years ago where I was in somebody's house, not a friend, but a friend of a friend. This was a guy who would not necessarily ever have been a friend of mine. But over his mantelpiece was a carving which said, God, Guns, and Guts, What Made America Great? And you have a title which is fairly similar, but you have one big difference: God, Guns, and Pornography. I never expected before this that when I got to page 83, I would be reading about pornography. What role does this play in men who feel threatened, feel the gender threat, suddenly turning to not only pornography, but a certain type of pornography?
Yeah, so that chapter, what we're really getting at is all of these other ways. So we do some big chapters on sexual harassment or about politics or about transgender bathrooms, things like that. But then we want to get into, look, there's lots of ways. Masculinity is very adaptable. You can create almost anything and turn it away to express your gender identity, express a masculine gender identity. So we have kind of a grab bag. All right, let's look at guns. Let's look at religion. And the last one we do there is pornography. Now, of course, the big reason that pornography has grown in the United States since the early 2000s is because of the availability of broadband internet. In fact, some people argue that broadband internet grew because of pornography. But what we're looking at, so there's actually a long history on men's use of pornography. A lot of people have done research on it. What we bring to the table that's new is we actually take a look at what genres of pornography they're using, which Bob will tell you, this will mess up your search history if you do a lot of research on this. Also, I have a young son, and the idea that we had to kind of speak in code words. So he thought we were doing a lot of research on poetry, and we were going to Poetry Hub, the world's largest source of online poetry. So we were looking at Pornhub, because Pornhub is the world's largest pornography site. It's in the top 10 of all websites on the internet, period. And what we did is we were actually able to use Google data, because people are very lazy, as it turns out. So we know they're using Pornhub, but it actually turns out within Google, you can do searches within Pornhub from Google, because it's such a big website. Google will actually let you do that. And so we can track what genres of pornography, because Pornhub divides the world into genres, people are looking up at various times, and track how those change over time. And so we find is that not only when men are subjected to economic stress, and so broadly we define economic stress as being when basically men lose their jobs but their wives don't. So married men, I don't have a job but my wife now does, or I lose income relative to her. So I used to be a breadwinner, now I'm not. When in areas where that's happening more, we see spikes, not just in pornography use, because that happens whenever unemployment goes up, but rather spikes in pornography use for specific genres that are more demeaning to women, that show men dominating women or even men hurting women. And those are the genres that spike up. And for me, that's the clearest indication. This is not just about men being at home and being bored and having broadband internet, but this is a way to try and symbolically take back power, symbolically dominate women. And that's also we see with guns. That's also we see with religion, that this is not necessarily about I'm going to do something myself, but rather I'm going to find a way to assert my gender, to show I'm still a man. And that can be something like buying a gun. The other thing we have to bear in mind is all of these things are culturally constrained, which I mean, this is a way of expressing my gender identity to myself and to the other people around me. So when these behaviors are only useful to the extent they are recognized by other people around you. So if you are here in New Jersey, carrying a gun is not really considered a recognizable form of masculinity, because nobody carries guns. We have very strict gun laws here. So we actually see that the gender identity threat doesn't make men carry guns more in states like New Jersey or New York. But if we go down to states like Arizona or Texas or Wyoming, that's where it goes up. So it has to be something that's already recognized. Same is true with religion. So when men become threatened, and we can actually even do this on individual surveys, which is a little terrifying, that I can ask you about your sexuality. And when I ask men about their sexuality, the men who are asked about sexuality become more likely to say, oh, I'm also a born-again Christian. They become more likely to report being evangelical or born again, but only in places where there's already lots of evangelical or born again Christians. So it's understood that being an evangelical born again Christian is a way of asserting a particular form of gender dominance.
I was so quick to get into the book that I didn't do what I normally do, which is to introduce your title, which is that you're a professor of government and politics at Fairleigh Dickinson University and executive director of the FDU poll. But that's going to be very important to my next question, because without getting too deep into the weeds concerning how this type of experimental research is done, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the threat prompt in 2016. The idea of just setting up a question concerning income and, who makes more in the House and who's going to vote for a candidate like a Donald Trump. Talk a little bit about that factor and when it's present and when it was absent in your research.
So this is actually how I came to this research. So I'm a political psychologist by training, right? I studied how people think about politics. And one of the big problems we have in political psychology and political cognition is trying to get people to change their minds, is that people just don't seem to change their minds very much. They don't pay much attention to what's going on. They don't change their minds. And so we always look for one of the strains of ways to try and get people to change their mind is to scare the bejesus out of them. Now, it used to be my advisor back in the 70s would do this by electroshocking people. And even when I was in grad school, we still had the electroshock machine there. We just weren't allowed to use it because ethics or something. You're not allowed to shock the undergraduates. So we have to have some other way of scaring them. And what we found essentially is that for men, gender identity threat is the strongest threat we have. That is, I get a bigger response from throwing men's gender into question than I do with threatening them with death. So this is the best way, right? It's the strongest thing we have. These men basically would rather be masculine and dead than be alive and be considered feminine. And this is not just, this is not all men, but this is a pretty big group, enough we can get good results from it. So we use this as a prime. And what that means is we run experiments in our polls. I run the poll. And one of the big reasons I do that is it gives me a chance to collect data and do science, do experiments. And as I tell my students, social science is essentially messing with people, then writing it down. So you have to do both of those things. You have to mess with people and you have to write it down. And this is the messing with people part of it, right? So half the respondents get a question where before we ask them who they're going to vote for, we ask them about their relative income. We say, boy, more and more in America, more women earn money than their husbands do. How about in your household? And when we ask this question, only about 15% of men nationwide say that their wives earn more than they do. Now, we know right off the bat they're lying because the true number is about 36%. But that's not the point. The point isn't that they're lying. The point is that I've just put in your head, hey, women are starting to outpace men. How do you feel about that? And that biases their responses to later questions. And they start to use later questions as a way of saying, oh, well, it's not with me. I'm good. Look how masculine I am. Like, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. I'm going to buy a gun. I'm going to say that society is favoring women. So I can use those sort of primes to experimentally induce a gender identity threat. Because it's one of the problems. It could be, you can say, well, the men who lose their jobs, maybe they're just disproportionately more macho guys, right? They're in construction or extraction. Those are more macho jobs. And so, yeah, they're more macho. That it's not that losing a job makes them macho. The people who lost their jobs are more macho. So it's really valuable to be able to just make any guy scared and see what happens. We should also note, it doesn't make men more conservative. What it actually does is it leads to polarization. So liberal men, when we scare them, they get more liberal. And conservative men, when we scare them, they get more conservative.
You seem like Bill Murray in the early scenes of Ghostbusters, where he just would be zapping the guys, but not zapping the young women. They don't let you do that in the real world.
They don't let us do it anymore. I mean, for good reason, but
Well, even Dr. Venkman got thrown off the campus for that. So let's just talk a little bit about how we can actually use this research. So anyone who reads the book will definitely have a better idea of why there is a connection between gender-threatened men and voting for someone like Donald Trump. How can this actually be used in society? Will it make men more aware of themselves? Is it simply just, hey, here's what it is? I'm not passing a judgment or trying to convince you to change your mind. I'm just explaining how things are and why they are.
Yeah, look, I'm a social scientist, right? I'm not a philosopher. I'm not here to say what is good and what is bad. That's the philosophy department down the hall. My job is to explain what is happening. And that said, I do think there's some behaviors that we document that are probably bad. I think workplace sexual harassment. I hope no one's going to push back on the idea that workplace sexual harassment is probably something socially undesirable and something we'd be better off if it wasn't happening as much. So what we do in the last couple chapters is really try and lay out, all right, are there other ways that are more socially desirable ways that men can assert their gender identities? And I think this is important because what we said, masculinity is super adaptable. And so one of my favorite examples of this is cooking, right? Cooking is traditionally a feminine task, but not always, right? So cooking everyday dinner, that's a feminine task because it has to be done on time. It has to be done every day, right? So it's kind of drudgery and it's time constrained. And that's what we think of as being a feminine task. However, special purpose meals, Thanksgiving dinner, or roasting thing, or barbecuing, right? Those are masculine tasks.
As long
So,
as it's meat.
well, not even just meat, right? But if it's meat and big portions of meat, especially if we're cooking outside, or if it's a special occasion, right? I have to go on the carve the turkey or whatever, like something like that. So there's this path in there for cooking to be masculine if we define the cooking as being something that is special, or we define as having to do with a lot of meat, right? And so we see is basically a total redefinition of what cooking is. So in the mid 90s, when we look at the data, when you scare men, when men get scared, they do less cooking because cooking is considered a feminine task. And this all changes in the late 1990s because of a TV show called Iron Chef, where Food Network basically starts running this very wacky Japanese food competition show in the late 90s. It becomes a huge hit. And Food Network pretty quickly becomes a channel that is completely about food competition shows. And you actually see a shift in the gender and the sex of the people doing the presentation, right? Prior to 98, basically every host on Food Network was a woman. And they're cooking something in their kitchen. At the end, they don't even get the chance that they pull something else out of the oven, they show it to you, Julia Child style. What we see after that with the cooking competition is it's almost all men, guys like Bobby Flay, who are super macho, right? And they're super macho and they're going to go in and they're going to take risks and they're going to use spice and they're going to use lots of fat and bacon and they're going to do these spectacularly risky things with things you've never eaten before and crazy ingredients. And it's masculine. And that filters down through society. And so by the time we get to the early 2000s, when you threaten men, they actually do start doing more cooking. They define cooking as being this macho activity. Oh, I'm going to use these crazy ingredients. I'm going to put lots of spice in there and lots of fat, and lots of bacon, and we're going to do this. And now cooking becomes a masculine activity. And that
And
is
one
good
which will
news.
help cardiologists throughout the
Well,
country too,
well,
as a
but the
result.
point is, right, it's that adaptable. We can take something that was feminine and in the course of 15 years, make it a masculine task. And that's a blueprint for what we can do. And so we show other examples, things like this, like parenting, that men can say, all right, maybe I'm not the breadwinner, but I am the world's best dad. And we see these crazy examples of men saying, I have a workshop in my basement and I make all of my kids' toys myself, right? I use wood and leather and metal and I make all this stuff myself. Well, that's masculinity. That's showing my gender identity in a way that's more positive by being, a good father. And who doesn't want that? So there are positive ways men can do it. And if we have to give a takeaway, something people should get from this, it is that masculinity is so adaptable, we can find positive ways, socially desirable ways for men to assert their gender identity that leaves everyone better off, including those men.
And just finally, who are gender threatened men who are acting more macho, using these compensatory behaviors? Who are they trying to impress? Is it other men? Is it women? Or is it themselves?
Is a combination of themselves and other men. These are displays for other men. My favorite example of this comes from strip clubs, right? when men go to strip clubs, they almost always go in a group. In fact, when you ask them, they'll tell you going to strip clubs by yourself is weird and creepy. Who would ever do that? And that's bizarre,
But
right?
not with other guys, not weird and creepy with other guys.
Right. So I'm going to go with a bunch of other guys and say, hey, look, I'm going to be sexually aroused by looking at these women. Let's all go be sexually aroused together. That doesn't sound terribly heterosexual to me, honestly. The idea that I want to be aroused with a bunch of other guys, but that's the point, right? Is that I am going to go with these other guys and say, hey, look how heterosexual I am. I'm aroused by these women. Aren't you too? So it's a way of saying I am masculine. I am heterosexual, and I'm displaying to other men. There's also, and this to me is perhaps the sadder part of it, is they are trying to show it to themselves, because there are some private behaviors like the use of pornography where these men are trying to show to themselves, no, look, I really am masculine. And when men aren't able to do that, when they're facing this sort of crisis where they can't show their masculinity to themselves, they can't prove it to themselves, the psychological consequences are really dire. And we hear about lots of men who are just kind of sitting on the couch. They're depressed. And their wives can't understand, like, well, you don't have a job. Okay, but at least do the shopping, at least do the cleaning, at least take care of the kids, do something. Don't just sit there playing video games all day. But they are not able, they have no way. They feel like they have no way to really assert their gender. They feel like they're just totally adrift. It's like Thor at the beginning of Avengers Endgame, right? Just sitting on the couch, playing games, getting fat because he's just depressed, he's upset. And that's the downside. And that's the crisis. And those men, those are the ones that get angry. Those are the ones that commit more violence. And those are the ones that we really need to reach out to and show, hey, there's other ways of being a man other than these societally constrained ways of being the breadwinner and buying a house and having 4 kids that are just not realistic in the year of our Lord 2021. There's no way every man can do that. And that's the point of those masculinity setups, is that they're aspirational. But then we tell men, if you don't reach these aspirational things that are impossible for almost every man, well, you're a failure. And men internalize that.
Yeah, and they do feel they have to impress other men. And there's an element of homophobia in it, too, because one of the things that you mentioned in a number of these social experiments was the idea that men would constantly say, after very specific primes, but I'm straight. I just want to tell you that I'm straight. That's constant. There was one in which there was hair braiding. Well, it was twisting string, but in one group, they were being told they were braiding hair, and in another group, they were tightening ropes.
Reinforcing
Same
ropes, right?
thing, right?
Right, it's
Same
exact
thing.
same skill. But then afterwards, they had to introduce themselves to the group, and the men who had been braiding hair rather than tightening ropes or reinforcing ropes were more likely to just spontaneously say, by the way, I'm straight, right? So the men feel, and I gotta say that we've actually seen that falling apart a little bit, is that it used to be, at least it still is among older generations, that heterosexuality was a big part of masculinity. And we don't see that as much, right? So we don't see as much anti-homosexual statements coming from younger people. What's really interesting to me, actually, is the research done on how homosexual men assert their masculinity and find ways of asserting their masculinity. And that can actually just be as toxic as it is among heterosexual men.
Let's just wrap it up, Dan, and please tell everyone where they can get a hold of the book. And I did mention that it's Stanford University Press, but I would think that after this half hour, that a lot of people would be very interested, whether from the political standpoint or the broader sociological standpoint, in reading Gender Threat.
Right. So Gender Threat came out end of last month, and it is available wherever you buy books. So you can order from Barnes & Noble, Amazon, or your local bookseller. Everyone will have it in stock, paperback or hardcover, up to you.
Dan, it's been great having you here again. Dan is one of the regulars here on the podcast, and we thank him because of the fact that he's on many other much larger media venues here. But
I like you, Bob, so I want to talk with you.
Well, thank you. I'm very, very impressed by that and very proud of that. And this is really a fascinating book. And Dan, just hang with me a little bit until after I do the sign off. That's it for this episode of Hot Media with Bob Mann. And we just want to let you know that you can find out more about this, which is still primarily an audio podcast. Go to the website, www.bobmann, that's with 2 N's. Those of you watching the video see the graphic, www.bobmannhotmedia.com. Please follow me on Twitter. My handle is @BobMannMedia. And we certainly hope that you join us on a regular basis. In addition, I just want to say that because as we do this initially, this episode, we will be taking a brief hiatus for Christmas and New Year's, and then we'll be back with a whole slew of new shows in 2022 as we talk about the hottest and most important issues in mass media right here on Hot Media. Thank you very much for joining us.